warnings from the U.S. at the United Nations Security Council and defiance from North Korea over nukes and missiles that one day could target America. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Brett Baer. Calling the North Koreans' test firing of an ICBM a, quote, clear and sharp military escalation. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said to an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council today, the U.S. will not forget this move and will not delay. There are plenty of questions tonight concerning just what the U.S. can and should do about North Korea's bold provocation. President Trump arrived in Poland a short time ago, where he will be consulting with world leaders in Europe over the next few days. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts starts us off tonight from Warsaw. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening to you. The stakes for President Trump's second foreign trip are much higher now that North Korea tested that intercontinental ballistic missile, dramatically ramping up the urgency to rein in the Hermit Kingdom.
As he left the White House bound for Warsaw this morning, President Trump sounded an optimistic note about rallying world support against North Korea. In public pronouncements, North Korea's closest neighbor, China, appeared to be saying the right thing.
China opposes the launch of missiles by North Korea in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. We urge the North Korean side to stop taking actions that violate United Nations Security Council resolutions and to create the necessary conditions for the resumption of talks.
But the president this morning made it clear he believes China has been saying one thing and doing another. On Twitter, pointing fingers at Beijing. Quote, trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. At the United Nations Security Council today, the White House was seeking a fierce condemnation of North Korea's test of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Russia's foreign minister warned against broadening the agenda of the meeting.
We presume that the objective set by the UN Security Council is that the two Koreas and their neighbors consists of the denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula, and it cannot and should not be used as a smokescreen to try to change the regime in North Korea.
North Korea will be a prime topic in what is arguably President Trump's most important meeting this week, his first face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in Germany. The president has advocated a more constructive relationship with Russia, but he acknowledges Russia's destabilizing behavior in Ukraine and Syria has made improving relations difficult. And of course, hanging over President Trump's interaction with Putin will be the cloud of the investigation into Russian meddling in the election campaign. In preparation for the G20, the president laid down a marker on another big issue today, trade, tweeting this morning, quote, the United States made some of the worst trade deals in world history. Why should we continue these deals with countries that do not help us? But in what looks like a preemptive strike against President Trump's expected tough talk, the European Union and Japan on Thursday will announce they have come to a broad agreement on trade. In a tweet clearly meant for U.S. consumption, Donald Tusk, the former Polish prime minister, now president of the European Union, wrote, quote, EU-Japan summit on Thursday. Ambitious, free and fair trade deal in the making.
President Trump also spoke with Egypt's President El-Sisi about North Korea today, stressing the importance for all countries to fully implement United Nations Security Council resolutions against North Korea, to stop hosting North Korean guest workers, and to not provide economic or military assistance to Pyongyang. Brett?
John Roberts live in Warsaw just after midnight Thursday. John, thank you. The U.S. joined South Korea and Japan in requesting that emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. As mentioned earlier, Ambassador Haley did not mince words in her delivery of a stern message. Senior correspondent Rick Leventhal is outside the UN right now. Good evening, Rick.
Good evening, Brett. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, says time is short, action is required, and the world is on notice that more needs to be done to rein in Kim Jong-un. It appears that the vast majority of the Security Council agrees. The question is, will it make a difference?
The Secretary General strongly condemns the launch of a ballistic missile of intercontinental range conducted by the DPRK. This action is yet another brazen violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions and constitutes a dangerous escalation of the situation.
Outrage and warnings, but no new sanctions yet from the United Nations Security Council, meeting in an emergency session over North Korea's historic launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. The UN has passed 15 resolutions against North Korea in the past 11 years, making it among the most sanctioned countries in the world. But international condemnation has so far done nothing to stop the regime of Kim Jong-un from testing missiles and developing its nuclear program. In Pyongyang, North Korea's dictator celebrated the launch, urging his scientists to keep sending big and small gift packages to the Yankees, suggesting he was hitting America in the nose on Independence Day.
Japan demands that North Korea immediately cease all ballistic missile and nuclear development programs and provocations. Japan will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley insisted today's meeting be open, hoping to make it more difficult for North Korean allies China and Russia to defend the rogue nation. China faces particularly intense pressure now since Chinese Ambassador Liu Jie is this month's Security Council president as part of the regular rotation. And Beijing has been accused of economically supporting its neighbor, even allegedly providing the truck used to launch Tuesday's ICBM.
There are countries that are allowing, even encouraging, trade with North Korea in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Such countries would also like to continue their trade arrangements with the United States. That's not going to happen. Such countries would also like to continue their trade arrangements with the United States. That's not going to happen.
Haley says the U.S. is prepared to take military action, but prefers not to. She also says the U.S. will propose a new resolution in the next few days that would punish nations doing business with North Korea, saying if we are united, we can restrict the flow of currency and oil to the rogue nation. And she singled out China, which supplies 90% of Pyongyang's imports. But both China and Russia have veto power on the Security Council, so any action that would single them out seems like a long shot. Brett?
Rick Leventhal sounds outside what sounds like a busy UN. Rick, thank you. American intelligence experts were watching as North Korea prepared for that missile launch, watching real time. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin reports from the Pentagon on why the U.S. did not try to shoot it down.
The Pentagon says this is not a missile it has seen before, and the new intercontinental ballistic missile was fired from a launch pad not used before by North Korea. A senior U.S. official tells Fox the U.S. watched the North Koreans prepare this liquid-fueled two-stage ICBM in advance. A Pentagon spokesman said the 37-minute flight time was the longest to date for a North Korean ballistic missile. Despite reports a mobile launcher was used, the missile was only transported to the launch pad, not fired from the vehicle. Kim Jong-un taunted the U.S. after watching the launch, adding he had no plans to negotiate. North Korean media said the missile could carry a, quote, large-sized heavy nuclear warhead, and said despite extreme overload and vibration, the nuclear warhead detonation control device successfully worked. Late yesterday, the Pentagon responded to the test by releasing this video of American and South Korean military units near Seoul testing short-range surface-to-surface missiles, which can travel up to 200 miles. Seoul, with its 10 million residents, is only 35 miles from the DMZ, or border. North Korea has thousands of artillery units pointed at South Korea's capital as a deterrent. And South Korea released a video simulating an attack on North Korea. When asked why the Pentagon did not shoot this missile down, a Pentagon spokesman said the U.S. military did not employ an elaborate missile defense shield because it did not threaten the U.S. homeland. What worries U.S. officials is this two-stage missile was able to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and now has the range to hit Alaska. The U.S. has dozens of interceptor missiles at bases in Alaska and California to shoot down a rogue North Korean missile in outer space. The U.S. Navy has one less tool in its defense shield arsenal after the USS Fitzgerald collided last month with a cargo ship near Japan. The Fitzgerald has advanced radar and missiles that could be used to shoot down a ballistic missile. The Navy's last test to shoot down a missile from a warship on June 22nd failed when the missile missed the target. But the U.S. Missile Defense Agency carried out a successful intercept of a mock ICBM fired from the Marshall Islands in May. Brett?
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. An American soldier has died in Afghanistan. Pentagon officials say Private Hanson Kirkpatrick of Wasilla, Alaska, died during a Taliban mortar attack in Helmand province Monday. 2 other soldiers were wounded in that attack. American forces returned fire, killing 2 Taliban and wounding others. 8 Americans have died in Afghanistan this year. 2,255 have died there since 2001. A senior Iraqi commander says about 300 ISIS terrorists remain in the small patch of Mosul's old city still controlled by the militants. It's all that's left after U.S.-backed Iraqi forces recaptured almost all of the area. A number of civilians are believed to be trapped in that ISIS-controlled territory. The 4 Arab nations at odds with Qatar over its support of terrorism and extremism and links to Iran are not happy with Qatar's response to their list of demands. Foreign ministers from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates met today in Cairo. They say Qatar's response was not serious and generally negative. The countries cut off relations with Qatar last month. The Trump administration has encouraged a negotiated end to this standoff. Several Middle Eastern airlines are reporting the U.S. has given exemptions to its recent ban on laptops in airplane cabins. Dubai-based Emirates Airlines, Istanbul-based Turkish Airlines, and Abu Dhabi-based Etihad have all said they've been cleared. Saudi Arabian Airlines says it hopes to be off the ban list by the middle of the month. We first told you in April about a former CIA officer who was convicted by an Italian court for a U.S. government-approved mission. There was no movement under the Obama administration, and it appeared the Trump White House would support her. But tonight, that officer is back in Italy, facing years of probation. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge looks at the diplomacy and the politics behind this story.
Totally, absolutely abandoned.
With the new administration, a former CIA officer thought her decade-long ordeal would end.
It's like the White House wanted to help, and then the swamp kicked in.
In 2009, an Italian court convicted Sabrina D'Souza in absentia, along with 24 others, connected to the U.S. government-sanctioned kidnapping of cleric Abu Omar. Some were pardoned, others live in the U.S., and were told to avoid countries with extradition treaties to the European Union. As a dual U.S.-Portuguese citizen, D'Souza's situation was more complex. She sat down with Fox earlier this year.
It sets a precedent where the U.S. allowed the convictions of intelligence officers and U.S. diplomats.
In February, after CIA Director Mike Pompeo and others in the Trump administration intervened, the Italian president reduced her sentence from 4 years to 3, in turn opening the door to a non-prison sentence. Brett Baier interviewed the Italian prime minister after the decision.
I have to say that the U.S. administration was very satisfied 1 month ago when the case was solved.
So you think it's pretty much wrapped up?
Yeah.
But for D'Souza, it was not over. A former Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Pete Hoekstra, says there were meetings with State Department and CIA officials, but D'Souza's options were limited. Stay in the U.S. when most of her family is overseas and risk the Italian government issuing a new arrest warrant, or go back to Italy and serve 3 years probation.
There wasn't a lot of counsel. They didn't tell her what to do. They just said, if you return to Italy, there will be risk. There's also tremendous risk associated with not returning to Italy. There are no good choices for Sabrina to make.
I was really hoping this time around, and really I was very, very optimistic. After 10, 12 years, this was a ray of light, really, but it just never happened at the end.
Former intelligence officers have told Fox News they are bothered by the case because it suggests the government does not have their back when they take on risk and a sanctioned mission goes bad. The CIA declined to comment, and the State Department had nothing new to add. A White House spokesman said they strongly disagreed with the characterization that D'Souza was abandoned, but could not immediately offer more details. Brett.
Catherine, thank you. D'Souza actually facing house arrest in Italy as well. President Trump's pick to run the FBI will appear before senators a week from today. Bureau Director nominee Christopher Wray will testify to the Senate Judiciary Committee on that day. Pro-government militias stormed Venezuela's Congress today. The protesters attacked opposition lawmakers with sticks and metal bars. 4 lawmakers were injured. It happened during a special session coinciding with Venezuela's Independence Day. The country is in a political and economic crisis that has seen Congress stripped of much of its power by the courts and President Nicolas Maduro. Back here in the U.S., a New York City police officer and her murderer are both dead tonight. The 12-year NYPD veteran was gunned down, assassinated while on duty, and the shooter was later killed by police. Attorney General Jeff Sessions is calling it a cold-blooded murder and the latest in a troubling series of attacks on police officers. Correspondent David Lee Miller has more from New York.
New York City's police commissioner is calling Wednesday's early morning fatal shooting of a police officer an assassination.
Based on what we know right now, it is clear this was an unprovoked attack on police officers who are assigned to keep the people of this great city safe.
12-year department veteran, 48-year-old Miosoto's Familia was sitting in the front passenger seat of an RV-sized vehicle called a mobile command center when a gunman fired through the window, striking her in the head. Her partner radioed for help. Minutes later, other officers arrived at the scene.
An anti-crime team consisting of a sergeant and a police officer who were in uniform encountered a male subject running on Morris Avenue. As they confronted him, he drew a revolver. The officers fired at him, striking and killing him. A silver revolver was covered at the scene.
Authorities say the gunman was 34-year-old Bronx resident Alexander Bonds. During his confrontation with police, a bystander was shot in the abdomen. There is nothing to suggest the shooter or Officer Familia knew one another. Bonds has a long criminal history. When 15 years old, he was accused of attacking a police officer with brass knuckles. 2 years ago, he was conditionally released from prison after serving 6 years for robbery. For many New Yorkers, the fatal shooting is reminiscent of the ambush killings of Officers Wenjin Liu and Rafael Ramos. They were also sitting in a police vehicle when they were shot execution style by a lone gunman. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio paid tribute to Officer Familia, who leaves behind 3 children.
She was on duty, serving this city, protecting people, doing what she believed in and doing the job she loved.
According to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, so far this year, 67 officers have lost their lives in the line of duty. That figure was 57 for the same period 1 year ago. That's an increase of 18% in fatalities. Brett.
David Lee, thank you. Several states across the U.S. are refusing to comply with a request from President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission for information on their state's voters. And now the White House is responding. Correspondent Kevin Cork tells us the headlines do not tell the entire story.
From coast to coast and in states red and blue, there's been strong resistance to the White House's attempts to obtain details about American voters in an effort, the White House says, to shore up the nation's election systems and to fight voter fraud. The White House Voter Integrity Commission seeking publicly available information when and only when recorded by and available from state voter rolls, including first and last names of all registrants, addresses, dates of birth, political party, last 4 digits of Social Security numbers, and more. While the headlines make state opposition seem almost unanimous, as is often the case, the headlines can be a bit misleading because while several states are refusing to cooperate, many others have agreed to release some voter information. For instance, Fox News reporting shows 25 states so far have declined to take part, while the White House says the number is actually 14 plus the District of Columbia. And while we found 18 states have agreed to comply, at least in part, the White House says the number is actually 20, and reports to the contrary, they say, are fake news. The president took to Twitter to question why there was so much resistance. Numerous states are refusing to give information to the very distinguished voter fraud panel. What are they trying to hide? That drew a sharp retort from Maryland's Democratic Attorney General, who called the request for voter data, quote, repugnant, and that it appears designed only to intimidate voters and to indulge President Trump's fantasy that he won the popular vote.
Giving the federal government one trove of all of this information about all of these voters in one place does present privacy concerns, not just that the government can't maintain information security, as we know hacking is a thing, but also that in the wrong hands, it would be too easily misused.
Backers say abuse of the voting system is the primary concern behind the commission, noting a 2012 Pew Research study that found almost 2 million dead voters still on voter rolls and almost 3 million people registered in multiple states, though that study did not find any evidence of actual voter fraud. The commission's very first meeting, Brett, is actually set for July 19th. That is, by the way, the very same day that the DNC has scheduled a meeting of its Voting Rights Commission. Brett?
Kevin, thank you. What do you think? Do you think states should comply with the commission's request? Let me know on Twitter at Brett Baer. You can use the hashtag Special Report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BrettBaerSR. Up next, exactly what does Made in America mean in products you buy? We'll take a look, plus the fallout of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. Next. When you and your family shop, does the Made in America label make a difference? For companies who want to use that label, it can make a huge difference to their bottom line. But exactly what does Made in America really mean? Correspondent William Lajeunesse takes a look tonight from Ontario, California.
It's born here and it's died here, just like me. I'm not going to China. I'm not going out of the country.
Tony Maglica started Maglite out of a garage in 1960. Today, it's a multi-million-dollar business that's struggling because of cheap imports and a California law that limits his ability to label his flashlights Made in America.
People who know it, they say, why don't you mark Made in USA? I said, I can't do it. I got sued.
Maglica sources all materials in the U.S. and fabricates everything else except this microchip and rubber O-ring. But under California law, a single rivet or screw can be too much. Maglite and other U.S. companies say the existing law is so inflexible, it allows trial lawyers to sue over trivial components.
A multi-tool manufacturer got sued for a foreign knife blade, a door lock maker for a few screws made in Mexico, and Maglite for a rubber seal from Taiwan. Each company lost.
So many companies avoid the Made in America label entirely because they can't risk losing million-dollar judgments.
If it's a question of cutting corners, saving money, and increasing profits, which is often really the case, then it shouldn't bear a label that's not honest and truthful.
Consumer groups support the California statute.
If a product says made in the USA, it should be genuinely made in the USA.
But Maglica and his attorney say that is impractical, since the U.S. no longer makes everything.
The problem is, if you insist on that rigid and that high a domestic content percentage, you're going to kill your own market. You're not going to be able to field a product at the quality you need at a price point that the public will accept.
Getting into U.S. stores is half the battle. Since American workers make more in a day than Mexican and Chinese workers make in a week, cheaper imports sell for a much lower price. To charge more, Maglite argues it needs the Made in America label.
Right now, the people looking at my product, they say, well, it's made in China like everything else.
Now, U.S. manufacturers support a bill that would be in Congress and enforced by the Federal Trade Commission that would set a standard of all or virtually all U.S. content that would override state statutes like California, they say is hurting, not helping the U.S. worker. Brett?
William, thank you. Volvo says it will begin producing electric motors on all of its vehicles in 2019. Volvo becomes the first major automaker to abandon the traditional internal combustion engine. The Swedish company says the decision was prompted by the wishes of its customers. Volvo aims to sell 1 million electrified and hybrid cars by 2025. Stocks here in the U.S. were mixed. The Dow lost 1. The S&P 500 was up 3.5. The Nasdaq gained 41. Should public funds be used to aid private religious schools? It's a question that's been debated for decades. Now, a recent Supreme Court ruling could mark a turning point. Correspondent Ellison Barber shows us how.
The ground underneath a jungle gym in Columbia, Missouri is giving school choice advocates renewed hope.
But I do think it lays down a marker.
Advocates like Daryl Allison are cheering the Supreme Court's decision to allow Trinity Lutheran Church to receive public money to rubberize the surface of its playground. School choice supporters believe the decision undermines a decades-old state law known as the Blaine Amendment that is often used to prevent families from using public scholarship money to send their children to a religious school. Missouri is one of 38 states with a Blaine Amendment in their state constitution. All similarly forbid direct government aid to institutions with a religious affiliation. Since 2015, at least 3 states have faced legal challenges to those amendments. Supporters of voucher programs see Blaine amendments as a barrier to a better education.
When we have national crisis or international crisis, whether it be a monsoon, hurricane, tornado, we have not only state government, national government, but we also have many faith-based institutions coming down with medical supplies, coming down to help with shelter, etc. No one pushes their hands up and say, who are you from? We're at a crisis level. Why don't we have that same approach when we talk about K-12 education?
And if public money can go to a religious institution's playground, they ask, why not the cost of enrollment? In the Supreme Court's ruling, there's a footnote from Chief Justice John Roberts that says, quote, we do not address religious uses of funding or other forms of discrimination. Critics of voucher programs say that's one reason this ruling is narrow. In a statement, the American Federation of Teachers says it, quote, was about providing a generally available benefit to a church that was not going to be used for religious purposes. But the Supreme Court did something else advocates are happy about, telling the Colorado Supreme Court to reconsider a case that deemed a voucher program unconstitutional.
It's the first time that the Blaine amendments have been called into question by the U.S. Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. School choice proponents are going to have a much easier road in legislatures around the country as they push for choice legislation to be passed.
The Colorado Supreme Court relied heavily on the Blaine Amendment in its ruling at issue whether or not states can allow parents to use tax credits from a publicly funded voucher program to send their child to a religious school. Brett?
Ellison, thank you. The Illinois State House will vote tomorrow on an attempt to override the governor's veto of the state's new budget. The state Senate has already done so. The budget calls for a $5 billion state income tax increase and $36 billion in spending. Illinois is deep in debt and is continuing to face a financial crisis. Britain's foreign secretary is backing a decision by the courts there to refuse to allow a terminally ill child to travel abroad for treatment of a rare genetic condition. The Vatican's Children's Hospital has offered to accept 11-month-old Charlie Gard. President Trump has also expressed support. A succession of British judges has backed specialists who say any experimental treatment will not help this baby and may cause him to suffer. More on this case now in the international spotlight with the panel a bit later. CNN is once again taking heavy fire tonight. Some are even alleging the news channel has engaged in attempted blackmail, a charge CNN strongly denies. Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, explains.
The person behind the wrestling video tweeted by President Trump, who's seen tackling a man with a Photoshopped CNN logo, has apologized. But the story behind that apology has sparked new criticism of CNN. The network saying the video endangers journalists tracked down its creator. His screen name, a crude takeoff on a Star Wars character, who first posted it on the online message board Reddit. The network isn't disclosing his identity, and that triggered a Twitter uproar and an on-air debate.
I mean, I think that we're protecting his safety.
Yes.
That CNN is protecting his safety because...
Is that our job?
Content,
it's a little
but at the
convenient
same
to
time, there is
apologize when you're exposed, and there's a lot of stuff on this person's site. You're not a bigot by accident.
Cuomo quickly deleted a tweet on the subject. The story by CNN's Andrew Kaczynski says CNN is not publishing Han Blank Solo's name because he is a private citizen who has issued an extensive statement of apology, showed his remorse by saying he has taken down all his offending posts, and because he said he is not going to repeat this ugly behavior on social media again. CNN reserves the right to publish his identity should any of that change. Is that a threat? Donald Trump Jr. accused the network of bullying the man, tweeting, "If only CNN spent as much time tracking down info on IRS targeting, Fast and Furious, Iran deal, etc., as they did a meme writer, hashtag CNN blackmail." The network spokesman said today CNN decided not to publish the name of the Reddit user out of concern for his safety. Any assertion that the network blackmailed or coerced him is false. CNN said the man apologized and deleted his account before speaking to its reporter, and that the network explained the withholding of his identity to be completely transparent. Quote, CNN never made any deal of any kind with the user. The Reddit user posted an apology for the posts made that were racist, bigoted, and anti-Semitic. "I am in no way this kind of person. The meme was created purely as satire, was not meant to be a call to violence against CNN or any other news affiliation." It's not unusual for a news outlet to withhold the identity of an obscure person caught up in controversy. While the CNN story suggests possible exposure if the user abandons his apologetic approach, there's no direct evidence of blackmail. Brett?
Howie, thank you. Now to a fascinating story today. There is renewed speculation tonight that Amelia Earhart may have survived the crash of her plane as she attempted her around-the-world flight in 1937. Speculation now with some new evidence. NBC News reports a History Channel documentary uncovered a photograph from the National Archives which may show Earhart and her navigator on a dock in the Marshall Islands. These investigators now believe Earhart died in Japanese custody. She was declared dead 2 years after she disappeared. Her remains were never found. We'll follow up on that. What can President Trump accomplish at the G20 summit, and what will happen with North Korea? We'll ask the panel when we come back.
Make no mistake, North Korea's launch of an ICBM is a clear and sharp military escalation. The North Korean regime openly states that its missiles are intended to deliver nuclear weapons to strike cities in the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And now it has greater capacity to do so. The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. We will use them if we must, but we prefer not to have to go in that direction. We will not forget, and we will not delay.
Stern warning from the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations talking about this launch of the ICBM this week. This was a dangerous launch, not only because of what it could do, but also what it did, saying it fell into the Japanese economic zone and it was a commercial area. Here's the Pentagon.
This was just one of many things about this that we are not pleased with North Korea's behavior on, is that they did not do that. That places shipping at risk. That places commercial aviation at risk. And it places space assets at risk. Because these are flying into areas where there's been no coordination and no closures conducted.
So what will happen with North Korea? What will President Trump do with European leaders and with his meeting with Russia's president and Chinese president over the next couple of days? Let's bring in our panel. Olivier Knox, Yahoo News chief Washington correspondent, Lisa Booth, columnist with the Washington Examiner, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Today, Olivier, that strong, stern warning, even threat from the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, where does that go?
Well, it raises the stakes for President Trump's meetings in Europe with President Xi of China, but also the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean President, and President Putin, of course. In the short term, it appears that the United States is pushing for more sanctions, or perhaps just to enforce the current ones properly. When a senior White House official told reporters at the White House a few weeks ago that when you watch North Korea's annual military parade in Pyongyang, you have to understand that nothing in that parade is made inside North Korea, and that's a testament to how poorly the sanctions regimes are enforced.
So, Lisa, the president tweeting this morning before leaving for Warsaw, Poland, the United States made some of the worst trade deals in world history. Why should we continue these deals with countries that do not help us? Trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. Here is the president on June 21st talking about that try.
I do like President Xi. I wish we would have a little more help with respect to North Korea from China, but that doesn't seem to be working out. But I do like the president a lot.
So it doesn't seem to be working out. I think that's the recurring message the president's sending. So what now?
I think that's certainly the case. The president is right. We've seen 37.4% increase between China and North Korea in the first quarter, so trade is increasing. We also saw Nikki Haley put trade on the table as well. We've had senators like Cory Gardner call for a complete economic embargo against North Korea. You know, one of the difficulties of the economic aspect of this is China is in so much control over North Korea's economy, 90% in regard to trade. So there aren't as many countries involved with the trade and with the economic buildup of North Korea. So that certainly makes things difficult. Nikki Haley also put military options on the table as well. We know that H.R. McMaster has said that President Trump asked for a military plan. Clearly, the difficulty with that is the proximity of the densely populated Seoul. 10 million people. Secretary Mattis has previously said this is absolutely a war that we do not want and could potentially lead to the most human casualties we've seen since 1953. So I don't think there are a lot of good options here. That's the reason nobody's really come up with any.
Yeah, it's also with a mobile launcher that we've seen for the first time, and this two-stage missile. We have talked about it yesterday, Charles, but South Korea is hosting the Olympics in 2018, coming up at the beginning of next year, and world nations will send their athletes to South Korea, possibly in the umbrella of uncertainty and crisis here. Here is the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, ahead of this meeting with President Trump, and also, obviously, yesterday, the meeting between President Putin and President Xi of China.
We presume that the objective set by the UN Security Council, which all participants in the six-party talks have accepted, that is, the two Koreas and their neighbors, consist in the denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula, and it cannot and should not be used as a smokescreen to try to change the regime in North Korea. Any attempts to defend a forceful solution using a Security Council resolution as an excuse is unacceptable and will bring unpredictable consequences to this region.
So they're laying markers down.
Look, anybody who expects we're going to get help from the Russians is whistling in the dark. The Russians have no interest in helping us out. The same way with the Chinese. They see a strategic advantage in retaining this thorn in our side. The only place that we're going to make progress is not in embargoes. Economics will not trump strategic objectives. Democracies like to think so sometimes. That's how we operate. It's not how dictatorships operate. All this stuff is smoke and mirrors. Great speech by Nikki Haley. It will have zero effect. We have two choices. We're either going to go to war or acquiesce. But there are two things that we can do in the interim that would be strategically risky but would have an effect. One would be to get the South Koreans to invite us to return the tactical nuclear weapons that we stationed there until 1991. That would get the attention of Pyongyang and of Beijing. And lastly, this is the last resort, you get the Japanese to announce they're going to go nuclear. That will get the immediate attention of the Chinese, who will have to decide which do they prefer, a divided Korean peninsula with a client state in the north, or a nuclear Japan. If we're not prepared to take those steps, nothing will happen, and North Korea will become a nuclear state.
The latest Fox poll, Olivier, on President Trump and North Korea has 56% of those polled saying President Trump is not tough enough. It's plus 40 on not tough enough over too tough or about right. Getting tough is tough.
Getting tough is tough. I mean, there aren't a lot of great options. You know, one of the challenges with, for example, returning tactical nukes to South Korea is what's the reaction from Pyongyang, where the #1 priority is regime survival? It's not that easy. The fact that there are between 8,000 and 10,000 North Korean artillery pieces pointed at South Korea, and that could reach Seoul. It's roughly the distance between the White House and Dulles Airport. That means that getting tough is very difficult. It's not Syria. You can't do a one-off cruise missile strike, because heaven only knows how Pyongyang is going to take it and how they'll respond. It's enormously difficult.
Yeah, and we don't know the status of how they've miniaturized nuclear weapons to be put on those missiles. At least it's a guesstimate right now, 12 months, 18 months, but who knows? They could have been further, Lisa. I want to forecast now ahead to Friday and this meeting with President Putin, between President Trump and President Putin. You know, that whole relationship obviously has come into focus with all the news and all the allegations, all the investigations. There's no indication that the president is going to mention this interference in 2016 elections. Back in the campaign, there was a back and forth about whether he actually ever met with Vladimir Putin. Here's just a taste of that. You were asked yesterday if you've ever spoken to Vladimir Putin, and you said, "I don't want to say."
Yeah, I have no comment on that. No comment. I was in Russia.
One of the things people like about you is to answer any question.
Because if let's assume I did, perhaps it was personal. You know, I don't want to hurt his confidence. But I know Russia well. I have no relationship with Putin. I don't think I've ever met him. I never met him. I don't think I've ever met him. You would know it if you did, wouldn't you? I think so. Yeah, I think so.
So he's now going to meet him if he hasn't before. He's obviously talked to him on the phone as president. But this is a high-stakes meeting.
Well, it certainly is, with Syria as well as Russia, the joint statement from Russia and China regarding North Korea and trying to put pressure on South Korea and the United States as well. So, of course, there's a lot to talk about. The stakes are high, given those two things I just mentioned. And also just given the fact that, look, if you look at the broadcast networks, there's been 353 minutes spent on, you know, the Russia narrative. So clearly this is going to be what the media wants to talk about. I think any sort of chumminess is what's going to be discussed. But I also have to think, you have to look at, too, of some of the actions that is taken. President Trump has been arguably tougher on Russia than President Obama throughout his administration. The sanctions still remain in place that President Obama put towards the end. We're trying to increase energy production, which hurts Russia, increase military spending as well. We have seen strong words from Nikki Haley as well as Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And, you know, the Obama administration didn't really do much in being tough on Russia. So I think that's something to keep in mind heading into that meeting as well.
Two alpha dogs.
Yeah, but the main item on the agenda is not Korea. The Russians are irrelevant. The main item on the agenda has to be Syria. We are now in the end game. What we're looking to is a Potsdam conference, like the one at the end of the Second World War that divided up the region, meaning Europe. We are now at the end of the ISIS phase of the Syrian civil war. We and the Russians have to decide on a demarcation line. That, I think, would be serious business. It would be strict realpolitik, and it's doable stuff. Everything else is pie in the sky.
We'll see if they both come out with some success to tout. Next up, the tragic case of a terminally ill British child and whether his parents or the courts should have the final say on his treatment and his life.
Connie and Chris are facing every parent's worst nightmare. They're struggling to understand why the court has not at least given Charlie the chance of treatment in America. The medical evidence is complex and the treatment offered potentially groundbreaking.
Charlie can't see, he can't hear, he can't move, he can't cry, he can't swallow.
Permission to appeal must be refused.
British courts making a decision on a terminally ill child, the treatment decision by the British hospital that's treating him. This issue putting President Trump and Pope Francis on the same side. The president tweeting this week, if we can help little Charlie Gard, as per our friends in the UK and the Pope, we would be delighted to do so. Pope Francis tweeting that to defend human life above all when it is wounded by illness is a duty of love that God entrusts to all. Olivia, this is a painful story no matter how you look at it, but it is also a story about government health care.
Sure, it is, and about who gets to make the decisions for parents and children and patients. Not letting the parents take Charlie home to die, for example. Obviously, all of these are enormously wrenching. I should say we're not immune to these kinds of debates in the United States. There was a case in 2007 having to do with Texas's futile care law, which said that hospitals could disconnect people on life support, I think, 10 days after they formally determined that they would never get better. But this is. I mean, as a parent, but just as a human being, this is just a wrenching tragedy.
Yeah, and of course echoes of Terry Schiavo in that case. Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and it's really devastating, particularly to hear people talk about a child's life as if it is just an object as opposed to a life, and how somehow that life is not valuable. But yeah, people are looking at socialized medicine with Britain's National Health Service and the dire financial straits that it's facing, as well as when you empower bureaucrats over individuals in making those decisions. There's also obviously parental rights involved in this and pro-life as well. And what does the value of a life mean to the United Kingdom or to people here in the United States as well? And it's particularly heart-wrenching to listen to the parents who have the money to try to look at experimental treatment in the United States and be denied that right. So it's an incredibly heartbreaking situation.
Debate in the British Parliament on this issue today.
If there is any room for discretion within the court rulings for Great Ormond Street to allow Charlie to leave and to transfer his care to doctors at Columbia University, and he is sufficiently stable to receive treatment, would the Prime Minister do all she can to bring the appropriate people together to try and make this happen?
It's an unimaginable position for anybody to be in. I'm confident that Great Ormond Street Hospital have and always will consider any offers or new information that has come forward with consideration of the well-being of a desperately ill child.
But Charles, in the short answer, that was no. They're not going to move the child.
Look, I think there are two approaches here, and I don't think it has to do with life in the abstract. It has to do with little Charlie and his own welfare. If I were the judge to come in, has to make a ruling, I would allow the child to die. He can't see, he can't hear, he can't speak, he can't swallow, and he has no control. He can't move, and he has terrible epilepsy. I've had a breathing tube in me for weeks on end, as he does, and it is a life of agony and great distress. I could protest I was an adult. He can't. But I'm not the objective judge, and I think there's one principle that overrides all this, and that is, in the end, it should be the parents who decide. You've got to have a highest authority here. It seems to me the highest authority always has to be the parents. I don't believe for a minute that there's a treatment that's going to make a difference, but if the parents want to try it, we ought to let them.
But it's tough when the parents can't be the child's advocate because of the court decision.
I think the courts are wrong in denying the parents the choice.
Particularly when they're incompetent parents as well. They're competent individuals who can determine that decision on their own.
Next up, thank you, panel. Some police officers know when to let things slide.